Hey everybody. So this is the second in a series that I'm doing on fascism. And I'm doing this series because I want to avoid a problem that I've been noticing on social media. It's a problem that I've seen quite a bit, and one that I could fall into myself if I'm not careful. The problem is that our news feeds quite often seem to become just one bad story after another, just an onslaught of stories, without a unifying theme that helps us to understand how those stories fit together. Instead, sometimes we can just hear about one more injustice or one more betrayal of our nation's values, or one more Christian leader saying something evil and stupid in defense of Donald Trump, or one more punch in the stomach to our democracy. And without enough analysis, I would say, of why all of those things are happening. And my point isn't that we shouldn't talk about those things. I think we absolutely have to talk about these things. The problem is when we just see a steady stream of that stuff and we don't understand how it fits into a system. And so what I've found is that as I've learned about fascism, I've started to understand why Trump and his movement are doing what they do. And I think that little by little, the more we understand, the less that we're going to feel like we're being pummeled by a movement that can't be stopped. And I think we'll stop being shocked that people we love are being taken in. And in my case, as a former pastor, it's helped me to get past simply being appalled every day, appalled at how large portions of the church are aligning with such a brutish and I would say obviously anti-Christian movement. Now that I have a better understanding of fascism, I'm not as shocked as I was. I've learned how religious movements are often used by demagogues to seize power. And the more I understand, I think the more I'm able to resist the people who are trying to do that to the church, to use the church in that way. So that's why I'm doing this series. I want to help us all get better at resisting what's being done to the nation, and especially to learn how to push back on what's happening in our own areas of interest. Mine happens to be the church, but let me just say this. If you're someone who doesn't like the word fascist being thrown around, I talked about that concern in the first video, so you can listen to that, but I'd also ask you to just think about the series this way. In the end, I don't care if you ever use the word fascist yourself, but what I want you to take seriously are the tactics that I'm going to be talking about throughout this series and the definitions that I'm laying out today and in a few videos after this. If you listen to me and you say, sure, I see those tactics being used and it's helpful to be aware of those, then good enough. I'm using the word fascist because I found that it helps me to see how the MAGA movement isn't just a historical anomaly. The MAGA movement fits a recognizable pattern, one that looks different in every country, but one that just has a lot of commonalities wherever you see it. So that's why I'm using the term. And I'm calling this series, Are We Fascist Yet? Because I want people to look at the patterns and to decide for themselves whether to actually use that term or not, but to at least understand what we're seeing. So this is the second video in that series. But for now, here's a broad definition. And I'll just tell you, you're not going to see this exact definition anywhere else because it's my own summary of a whole bunch of other definitions. So by all means, please push back on me. It's a working definition. And I'm expanding on my working definition right here that I talked about 3 years ago in my first video on fascism. So here it is. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader to amass unchecked power and personal wealth by exploiting cultural grievances, stoking nationalist anxiety, legitimizing violence against a chosen other, and turning the crowd into a weapon against the institutions of democracy itself. So that's a mouthful, and there's a reason people use shorter definitions than that. Jason Stanley uses a very brief summary of fascism in the subtitle of his book, How Fascism Works. He says, the politics of us versus them. The politics of us versus them, that phrase right there takes us a long way toward understanding something really important about fascism. But my definition, basically I'm including all the main things that I think have to be there, or at least most of these, for us to call something fascist. You know, there's lots of different types of authoritarianism, but there's some specific things about fascist authoritarianism. So let's look at each of the parts of the definition, and I'll explain why each part is important here. That first line is key. So we'll start there, obviously, because it's key because fascism isn't an ideology. Fascism is a strategy. And I think this is so important to understand. I think it's possible, for instance, to envision what a Marxist utopia might look like. You know, Marxism is an ideology, you know, or a democratic capitalist utopia. We can, you know, sort of imagine what that might look like. It might not be achievable, but you know, those sorts of things operate as a somewhat coherent ideology about how things ought to be. But fascism isn't like that. Fascism is about power. It's a strategy, first and foremost, for accumulating power. And so, like, I've listened to Christian nationalists, for instance, who describe their ideal system of government, and they don't call it fascist. They might describe it as a white Protestant ethno-state or a Catholic autocracy or whatever their branch of humanity is. You know, they'll describe it in ways that fit that branch, you know, sort of their core beliefs. But the tactics that they use, the methods that they use to achieve that kind of power, all of that, the way they talk, is recognizably fascist. Fascism is about acquiring power. It's a strategy for dominance and control. It's not a coherent belief system about the most just system of government once the fascists achieve control. It's not about that. It's about getting control. So let's move on then. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader. I don't think that you can have fascism without a charismatic leader. You can have a lot of unrest. You can even have, you know, civil war, that sort of thing. But I don't think it's going to turn into a fascist movement unless a leader arises to sort of gather people around himself. And I use the word himself. It could be a woman who's demonstrating this, although I've said before that I think what I've noticed with fascist leaders like Carrie Lake, for instance, or Kristi Noem, they still use a lot of macho kind of language and a lot of macho sort of framing of their, you know, personality. So I'll talk more about that, like I said, in a specific video about fascist leaders. But for today, I'm just going to assert that a fascist movement seems to require a charismatic leader to mobilize people. So let's move on. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader to amass unchecked power and personal wealth. And I just can't emphasize this point enough. I mean, it's possible that a fascist leader might actually believe the rhetoric he's using. And we'll get into that rhetoric next. But it's not about those ideas in the rhetoric in the end. And we see this so clearly with Donald Trump. He's made it so clear in so many levels that he doesn't believe some of the Christian rhetoric that he puts out there, but he sees that that rhetoric is useful. Donald Trump is not trying to establish a Christian nation. Some people who are globbing onto him are trying to do that through him. But Donald Trump is trying to enrich himself and empower himself. Fascism is about amassing power and wealth for the leader. Everything in the system then revolves around empowering the leader. So just like in America today, you know, we see a lot of church leaders who point their congregations to Donald Trump. The Republican Party has turned over its entire purpose to advancing Donald Trump's agenda. And we're seeing Trump corruptly expand his wealth in ways that have never been so blatant in this country before, and Republicans in Congress seem to be okay with it. What Trump is doing might look normal to anyone in Russia, for instance, but that's not the system we claim to have here. Fascist leaders, though, they always empower themselves and they enrich their families at the expense of the nation. That's just what they do. So again, we'll go deep into all of that in a later video. So moving on. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader to amass unchecked power and personal wealth by exploiting cultural grievances. And again, I just don't think that you have fascism without appeals to cultural grievances. And this is why in the US, I don't think any fascist movement will ever succeed here without the help of conservative, traditional-minded Christians, which is, again, one reason I talk about this. Some other type of authoritarian movement could take over in America someday, but the specific nature of fascism is that it appeals to traditional culture, and it plays on grievances of people who think they're losing the old ways. And the traditional culture in the United States has always been overwhelmingly some form of Christian culture. And that's why, like I said, it's important to me in particular, as someone who's pastored people for so many years, to call MAGA a fascist movement and to identify Trump as a fascist leader. I have to say these things because the specific nature of this movement is to exploit Christian cultural grievances. But then moving on, we see another side of it. We see that fascist leaders not only exploit cultural grievances, but they stoke nationalist anxiety. So not all fascists are Christians, certainly not, but they're all some sort of traditionalist, someone who's wedded to the old ways. And often that's someone who has a strong nationalistic bent, someone who's afraid of losing their national identity. So that's why at a Trump rally, you see all sorts of Christian signs and signs talking about cultural issues that conservative Christians claim to care about. But you also see a lot of nationalist imagery, and most of those people wouldn't say their faith is even that important to them. If anything, their faith might be more of a marker of their nationalism, like America's a Christian nation, so I suppose that makes me Christian. But they're more driven by nationalism than faith. But the thread that ties both sides of that equation together is traditional culture, whether it's traditional religious culture or traditional national culture. They've got grievances about traditional culture, and they're afraid of losing their national identity. And so another way people describe fascism, quite simply, is through this phrase that kind of captures some of this phrase, blood and soil. These are our people, and this is our land. Blood and soil. These are our people, and this is our land. And that also leads into the next part of my definition, which is legitimizing violence against a chosen other. And again, I don't think you can have a fascist movement without violence, at least without the leader talking about violence and legitimizing violence, whether it's happened yet or not. And what we'll see when I get to the specific video on the link between violence and the MAGA movement, we'll see that it's pretty shocking to see all the ways that this has come into play during the Trump years. But it's important to note that the violence is directed against a chosen other quite often in fascist movements. Quite often immigrants are the scapegoats, but what we'll see is that once a fascist leader starts to get more powerful, the definition of the other is always going to expand in a fascist movement until in the end, the other becomes anyone who disagrees with the leader. And violence is legitimate when it's directed at enemies of the leader in a fascist movement. And I'd say we're partway there in America right now. We've seen it. We've seen violence from the MAGA movement, and I think we're trending in a really bad direction. But I hope we never get there fully, and I'll have more to say again about that in a later video. But let's move on to this next line about the crowd, turning the crowd into a weapon. Without the crowd, at least in the early stages, a fascist leader is nothing, really. Fascist movements are a type of populist movement. Not all populist leaders are fascists, but every fascist leader is a populist. It's how fascism works. And so we've obviously seen that in Donald Trump. Even though he's president of the United States, his power base, his real power base, is still his MAGA fans. Republicans could stop him from doing almost anything. They could impeach him. They have that power. But they don't stop him from doing anything yet. And the reason they don't is because they're afraid of his base. They're afraid of his crowd. They don't want to be primaried or worse. We saw Lisa Murkowski recently, a Republican senator, talk about fear in a way that I've never heard an elected official talk about fear in my lifetime. And Trump, like every fascist leader before him, has just gathered this crowd to himself and spoken to them in such a way that they've become entirely loyal to him, and they've made themselves available to him as a political weapon, at least, that he can use against his opponents. And we've seen them actually get violent, not just exercising political power. So more on that also in a later video. But here's the final piece of the definition. I'll just read the whole thing again. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader to amass unchecked power and personal wealth by exploiting cultural grievances, stoking nationalist anxiety, legitimizing violence against a chosen other, and turning the crowd into a weapon against the institutions of democracy itself. And this is what we're seeing today. Trump has so rallied his base that elected Republicans fear him, and they fear his base, which stops them from protecting the institutions of our democracy, institutions that would put a limit on Trump's power. And that word institutions carries a lot of weight in my definition. It means things like as simple as the right to vote, at the most basic level. But it means also like our governmental systems, like our justice system. It means our media institutions, our universities, our private businesses, even our churches. Any institution of society that you can think of that tries to operate outside the control of the fascist leader will eventually be attacked. It might be through the legal system, it might be through regulations, but in any way that the fascist leader is able to do so, he will try to bring every institution under his thumb as his power grows. And Project 2025 is dangerous for a lot of reasons, but this reason is central to why it's dangerous. Trump has people in his camp right now who've been spending years trying to find all these little levers of power, all the little levers that the federal government might be able to use to empower Trump just a little bit more every day. Just a recent example that I think most people know about is how the federal government used Trump's power to veto a merger. They used the threat of that power in order to extort millions of dollars out of Paramount. And Trump wouldn't say it was extortion, obviously, but Stephen Colbert, who's part of the Paramount family, called it a bribe. And it was all over a ludicrous lawsuit about the way 60 Minutes edited a Kamala Harris interview. But I think it was about far more than that. I think it was meant to be an egregious example just of the power that Trump has against a private media institution. He has that power of vetoing a merger if he abuses his power. And he used that to show this is what I can do and you need to fear me. So the reason Trump right now keeps losing in court lately is that he and his people keep trying all these little levers, and a lot of them aren't legal, but they keep trying them to find the levers that actually move something. And most of those levers won't work. But enough of those things that they're trying are working that an awful lot of universities, for instance, and businesses and private institutions are capitulating to him rather than try to go to court against the federal government. So that's all important stuff. And again, there'll be a long video about that. So in high school, I learned that fascism isn't an economic system, in the way that, say, communism or capitalism is. But if you were to describe it as an economic system, it would look like this. Capitalism is private ownership and private control of business. Communism is government ownership and government control of business. But fascism is private ownership, but government control of business. And I didn't really understand what that meant until I watched Schindler's List, like years after I heard that in high school. But now I feel like I'm seeing it very clearly, what that looks like in America. It's not an accident that a bunch of billionaires lined up behind Trump at his inaugural address. So anyway, I'm going to have a lot more to say about all of this stuff. But I think I'm just going to stop for today. And I just want to say again, when it comes to fascist, whether you accept the label or not, I hope you pay attention to the definitions. And later when I get into the specific tactics that they use, my goal isn't to call names, but my goal is to describe what I'm seeing and to name it clearly if it has a name. So when you look at it closely, I think you'll see that Donald Trump and his MAGA movement look pretty fascist. I mean, at least they do to me. And that feels like an important thing to talk about. So thanks for listening.